Well, first, thank you very much, Your Honor, and to Elder Mead for welcoming me this evening and for getting us started in a good way and reminding us of the importance of this work. And of course, to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation for helping organize this important speaker series and inviting me to be a part of it, and for all of you folks who are repeat attendees at the series. Thank you so much for what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So thank you all for gathering, witnessing, holding some space today, and thinking about education's role broadly in the work of reconciliation. And while I'm a non-Indigenous historian, I have a residential school survivor in my family, and I have a responsibility to honor him and the courage it took for him and others to break their silence about their experience. And I do this work in part to honor Patrick. And so what I want to do this evening is talk more about some of my new research that is trying to grapple with and confront the growing and concerning phenomenon of residential school denialism in Canada, or those who refuse to believe the truth. Focusing specifically, to help us, on the case of former Senator Lynn Beck, and what it can teach us about how to identify and confront denialism more broadly. Now, Beck, as perhaps the most notable person spreading denialism, has made a lot of news recently. She illegally donated to Donald Trump's first failed re-election campaign. She sat maskless in the Senate during the height of the second wave of the global COVID-19 pandemic. And then in January 2021, she announced her early retirement from the Red Chamber, mostly because the Senate was, thanks to the work of Indigenous Senator Mary Jane McCallum from Manitoba, going to hold a vote to expel her. And if expelled, Beck wouldn't be entitled to her full pension. Denialists desperately want to platform and spread their ideas, but they don't like facing any consequences for their actions. There is, in short, a lot to the Beck saga, and I don't have time to cover all of the twists and turns tonight. Instead, my work looks specifically at Beck's controversial 2017 Senate speech and the 100 support letters she received and then posted on her Senate website and refused to remove for years, which is really at the heart of the Beck's story, and I think reveals a lot about denialism, how we can identify it, how we can confront it. So my talk this evening is going to historicize, contextualize, and theorize residential school denialism to give us a frame. And then I'm going to use that frame to critically examine Beck's public comments and her support letters to show how they embrace and promote residential school denialism as part of an attack on truth and reconciliation in Canada. And all of this really, I think, can teach us important lessons about what we can do about it. And while I'll note that I've taken care to try and avoid traumatic content about residential schools, as Elder Mead was speaking about, the presentation does contain some details that may be upsetting, and I've put the Indian Residential School Survivors and Family Crisis Line number there. You can always send me an email if you'd like to debrief after. We have a reception so we can talk things out in a good way. But if you do need additional resources, there are many, and I would suggest starting with that. Okay, everybody can hear me in the back of the room? Everybody can see? Okay, let's get going. In March 2017, Lynn Beck, a conservative senator and a member of the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, delivered a speech defending Canada's Indian residential school system as being, quote, well-intentioned. Beck briefly admitted that mistakes were made, but she spent the majority of her speech insisting that an emphasis on the system's positives will help, quote, Canada's Native people to thrive as victors, not victims. Bayek's speech, made only a year after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, showed Canadians the evidence of how residential schooling constituted genocide, sparked an intense public controversy. The senator's attempts to put a positive spin on what even Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister who appointed Bayek to the Senate, called a sad chapter in Canada's history, was not appreciated by many, including her fellow senator at the time and the former chair of the TRC, Murray Sinclair, who, when initially asked about Bayek's comments and other residential school deniers, called them, quote, dim-witted. Even the Anglican Church, which ran a third of the schools across the country, including the Pelican Lake Residential School near Dryden, Ontario, where Bayek lives, weighed into the debate to clarify that, in fact, nothing good came from the schools. Now, the church, like the TRC, noted that while a small minority of survivors speak of positive school experiences on a personal or individual level, those experiences must be understood as occurring in the wider context of a genocidal school system designed to kill the Indian and the child. Despite facing widespread criticism, Bayek refused to apologize for her comments. Instead, the senator stood behind her positive perspective and even attacking criticism of her speech as fake news and exaggeration. Remember, this is just after President Trump is elected in the United States, so fake news was the way to get out of a lot of things. Bayek doubled down on her defense of residential schooling, arguing, quote, "There are shining examples from sea to sea of people who owe their lives to the schools." When pressed on how Indigenous people, especially the many former students who were physically and sexually abused in the schools, like my family member, might feel about such statements, Bayek elaborated, quote, "I've suffered with them. I appreciate their suffering more than they'll ever know, but the best way to heal is to move forward together, not to blame, not to point fingers, not to live in the past." You know you've really stepped in it when the Beaverton, which is a satirical news site, kind of like The Onion in the United States, has a good laugh at your expense, saying that Senator Bayek demands residential school survivors apologize for her suffering. But more seriously, when she was confronted by reporters and asked directly if she had even bothered to read the TRC report to better understand the history and ongoing legacy of the schools, Bayek simply stated, quote, "I don't need any more education." As a result of her comments, Bayek was removed from the Senate Committee on Indigenous Issues in 2017. She was later kicked out of the Conservative caucus, but she retained her Senate seat for another 4 years and used her platform and position to popularize residential school denialism. It seemed like that was the only thing she was actually doing. Now, residential school denialism, to be very clear, is not the denial that the system existed, but rather by definition, denialism is the rejection or the attempt to twist, misrepresent, or discredit basic facts rooted in well-documented evidence in favor of more controversial positions. In this way, residential school denialism, especially in our age of mis and disinformation, can be understood as being quite similar to things like climate change denialism or science denialism, which we have seen proliferate in the last number of years. Denialism is, in general, a strategy used to try and shake public confidence in something. And in this case, residential school denialism is trying to shake public confidence in truth and reconciliation. And I'm going to explain why in a moment. Now, while not wanting former students of residential schools to dwell on their victimization at the hands of church and state officials, in the aftermath of her 2017 comments, Bayek quickly constructed herself as a victim of politically motivated attacks on free speech. Rather than reflection, Bayek dug in and fortified her position by using her Senate website, this is a screen grab of her website, to post the full text of her speech as well as further personal statements and a selection of letters she received supporting her comments. So she uses her website to defend herself, essentially. Now, it's tempting to stereotype those who engage in residential school denialism as being ignorant bigots, or to simply ignore them, so as to deny them the recognition they seek for themselves and their ideas. Silence, some say, starves denialists of their sustenance, which is dialogue. Alternatively, some want to turn to authority, institutions, police, even the law, to shut down talks, to stop people from being able to, from doing what they're doing. But this often tends to give denialists what they want most, which is a platform to spread their ideas and the ability to say that they are being persecuted. And they can use that victimization to fundraise and get more opportunities. It's a strategy. So what do we do? Murray Sinclair, right, who was calling Bayek at first dim-witted, suggests a different strategy that I try and amplify and build on in my work, and I'm inviting folks to consider as a way to counteract this growing phenomenon of denialism. Sinclair argues that it is actually not enough for us to simply yell at deniers, call them names, and knock them down, as satisfying as that is sometimes. Instead, we need to try to understand their reasoning and show that they are wrong. He elaborates saying, quote, "I've always been convinced that while we may not be able to deal with all of the denialists, by challenging the comments of high-profile people like Bayek and others, as I'll talk about, Sinclair is hopeful that denialists will have a diminishing population of people who will believe them." Sinclair, in short, advocates a strategy of engagement and education to contain, disprove, and discredit denialists. Taking away the tools of residential school denialists requires a better understanding of those tools and how and why people employ and defend them. In that spirit, my work documents and interrogates the Bayek controversy as a way of comprehending and confronting not just Bayek, but the phenomenon of residential school denialism in Canada generally. So it's important to begin by emphasizing that residential school denialism is not actually a new phenomenon. It's taken on a life of its own in the last number of years, but it's not new. Indeed, downplaying or minimizing the destructive effects of residential schooling for Indigenous children has a long history in Canada, going back to the origins of the system in the 1880s, at least. For much of the system's history, state and church officials likened the schools to a humanitarian, even sacred, enterprise designed to save Indigenous communities from extinction in the face of a so-called higher form of civilization. That was the rhetoric that was used to justify the system for over 100 years. Even when faced with irrefutable evidence of poor instruction, horrific conditions in many of the schools, physical, sexual abuse, officials mostly clung to this humanitarian discourse and discredited the system's detractors, including some Indigenous parents and students, of course, but also non-Indigenous experts at the time as well. In the early 1900s, as the system was still getting started, Dr. Peter Bryce, for example, published a report for the Department of Indian Affairs slamming residential schools for their abnormally high rate of student death and disease that he suggested was exacerbated by overcrowding, poor nutrition, and a lack of proper sanitation at many of the schools. This is in 1907. His report, as my research collaborator and special guest this evening, University of Manitoba law student Katie McKenzie, and I have written about, this report was actually leaked to the press and covered in newspapers across the country from Ottawa to Vancouver Island. And this is actually a screen grab of one of the articles from a newspaper in BC, which says Indian schools deal out death. Startling rate of mortality is shown in the report to the department, at least 25% of children dying. Right? So it's easier for us to think, oh, nobody knew at the time, or this was a report that nobody saw. This is actually being reported in newspapers. But instead of rectifying the system's obvious problems, the department chose to bury Bryce's report. As a medical expert, Bryce tried to blow the whistle on the school system in its initial phase, and he's so frustrated that he's been asked to report, he makes the report, then they push him aside, that he published his findings independently as a book that he paid for called The Story of a National Crime in 1922. So a full 100 years before many Canadians were brought into the knowledge of death, disease, and things in residential schools. The Department of Indian Affairs' own medical expert was trying to blow the whistle. But for the most part, officials chose to selectively focus on the positives of the system. And the system was allowed to continue for another 80 years. The system doesn't end until the 1990s. It was not until former students began publishing accounts of their abuse in schools and organizing for redress in the 1980s that this humanitarian discourse about residential schools started to shift significantly in the mainstream. As more students spoke out about their negative school experiences, they emboldened others to come forward, eventually sparking a movement led by former students to collectively seek compensation for their time spent in the institutions. With many state and church officials still denying any wrongdoing in the 1980s and 1990s, students forced the issue by launching the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, which the Government of Canada chose to settle out of court by agreeing to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2006-2007. A lot of people think, Canadians just sort of came to the realization that this was bad, and that's how Truth and Reconciliation was put on the agenda. In fact, it was former students launching this class action lawsuit and forcing the Canadian government into the position of settling out of court. And this settlement puts in motion a number of things, including an official apology by the federal government, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation process to research and raise national awareness about residential schooling, right, as part of the remedy of this class action lawsuit. And this is the unveiling by the commissioners in 2015. And that report by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission shocked, I think, many Canadians, but confirmed what generations of Indigenous peoples and historians already well understood. The Commission, however, made clear that shaming and pointing out wrongdoing was not the TRC's mandate. Instead, the focus on truth determination was intended to lay the foundation for the important question of reconciliation. Perhaps the most important part of the TRC's argument is that we need to have truth before reconciliation. Now, many Canadians have embraced the challenge put forward by the TRC and are, in differing ways, engaged in reckoning with Canada's colonial past to create a better future. I imagine those of you taking a couple hours out of your Thursday evening are here for that very reason. Others, however, are choosing to dispute, deny, and discredit the Commission's findings as an excuse to avoid participating in reconciliation. You don't have to deal with a history that you deny. Now, to be sure, this is the difficult part of the conversation. Grappling with matters of genocide is not easy. But it is the task that Indigenous and in particular non-Indigenous people living in what is currently Canada are being asked to do in the era of truth and reconciliation. So let me offer some thoughts about how we might think about what we can do. And here, scholarly literature in the field of genocide studies can actually help shed light on how different countries around the world are dealing with the legacies of different kinds of genocide and addressing the phenomenon of denialism in particular. In fact, in the field of genocide studies, denial is often understood to be the final stage of a genocide. It's not that Canada is necessarily original. And political scientist Adam Jones argues that the manipulation of memory and history often occurs in the aftermath of genocides. And looking at Germany's grappling with the Jewish Holocaust as an example, he shows how a willful amnesia, or a politicized forgetting, emerged in the immediate post-war period as a way to distance the country and its citizens from its very recent Nazi past and its ongoing effects. In reflecting on the psychology of denialism, Jones argues that individual and collective narcissism play a pivotal role in buttressing denial. In many contexts, the denialist stance heads off cognitive dissonance between one's preferred view of self and country and the grimmer reality. There's also usually an element of material self-interest. We'll come back to both of those. Now, insights from genocide studies overlap with lessons from recent Indigenous studies literature, my field, on the role of denial in Canada. Scholars such as former colleagues at the University of Manitoba, Gina Starblanket and Dallas Hunt, their recent book on the Gerald Stanley trial, illustrate how Canadians like to imagine that they've always acted with peaceful good intentions. Canadians do not like to hear that their country was founded through frauds, abuses, and even violence perpetrated against Indigenous peoples. Instead of confronting this reality, Canadians seek refuge in myths of benevolence and self-congratulatory accounts of the past that justify colonial policy as being well-intentioned, even necessary and enlightened. And it's not just about residential schools. The Indian Act was well-intentioned, it was benevolent, et cetera, et cetera. To be Canadian, according to Stolo writer Lee Maracle, is to be sunk in deep denial. Instead of seeing reconciliation as an opportunity to change their relations, Maracle argues that Canadians, quote, tend toward defensiveness. It's also helpful to theorize the role of denialism in colonial settings, and here I turn to the work of anti-colonial writers from outside of Canada, and I'll keep the theory part very short for a Thursday evening. But I think it's helpful. In particular, Albert Memmi's phenomenal book, The Colonizer and the Colonized, which consists of a psychological profile of both based on the author's experiences in North Africa, is especially insightful because it looks at the role of denialism in legitimizing colonialism as commonsensical. While Indigenous scholars, such as my colleague at the University of Manitoba, Emma Larocque, have examined Memmi's portrait of the colonized in relation to Indigenous struggles in Canada, I think it is helpful to focus on Memmi's portrait of the colonizer and its applicability to Canadian settlers. And this aspect of Memmi's work has received less attention. So let me just talk very briefly about this, because it will help us understand, I think, why people are engaging in denialism today. So, Memmi argues that colonizers are daily confronted with the reality of the illegitimacy of their status. Their very existence is a crisis of legitimacy. Whether colonizers are immigrants or are born in the colonies, they are always, even if only subconsciously, plagued by the question, what entitles me to live here? Fears about retribution and revenge only stoke an ever kind of present colonial anxiety, as I think Starblanket and Hunt's new book make clear, is very evident here in the prairies in particular. In an attempt to resolve these unsettling feelings, colonizers invent and deploy a whole host of strategies to protect their position of privilege in the colonies and prove to themselves and to others the legitimacy of their existence, the right to live and prosper. In addition to creating specific laws, the creation of institutions such as prisons and schools to contain and control the colonized physically, Memi contains that colonizers also invent and invest themselves in a series of myths and stereotypes. And I know that was another talk in the speaker series about stereotypes and the dehumanization that happens and its role in legitimizing colonialism past and present. And here Memi is saying we should look to everything from art and education, the writing of history. All of these things can be ways of rationalizing the oppressive colonial relationship that underpins the material prosperity of colonizers as natural, inevitable, and most importantly, unchangeable. Although Memi argues that all colonizers benefit from colonialism in some form or fashion, he differentiates the behavior of two main groups: the colonizer who refuses and the colonizer who accepts. In short, the colonizer who refuses comes to the realization that colonialism is in fact unjust and vows to challenge the oppression of the colonized and fight for their freedom. This is no easy task, though, because the liberation of the colonized requires colonizers to question and challenge the legitimacy of their existence. As a result, Memi argues that most colonizers simply resign themselves to accept colonialism and its benefits, becoming colonizers who accept. Okay, that's enough theory for a Thursday evening. So that's the frame. Properly historicized, contextualized, and theorized, I argue that denialism can thus be understood as a powerful tool for protecting the status quo in colonial settings, such as Canada. Rather than unsettle the history of Canada and confront the ongoing legacy of colonization, including things like residential schools, as Memi's colonizer who refuses might do, some Canadians, like Bayek, are employing the tools of Memi's the colonizer who accepts. That is, they deploy a denialist discourse that justifies their existence, their home on native land, through a combination of degrading Indigenous peoples and clinging to selective and self-congratulatory accounts of the past that they think absolves them of any wrongdoing and justifies their lack of support for reconciliation. Okay, back to Bayek. Senator Bayek's controversial comments in the Senate in 2017 defending residential schooling and the kinds of comments they catalyzed need to be understood in this wider context as a strategy, as a tool for denying the injustices of the past and present to safeguard colonial power and privilege in the unsettling time of truth and reconciliation. Now, I don't have time to fully get into Bayek's speech, but just a couple of points before I move on to talk about her support letters, which is really the focus of my analysis and I think might help explain some of the things that you might be seeing out in the world. So Bayek's speech promoted a whole host of ignorant and incorrect views about Indigenous people. It's a dog's breakfast, to be honest, including her belief that, on balance, residential schooling should be considered beneficial for Indigenous people. In her speech, Bayek used what is known as false balance. This is a form of bias that suggests an issue is more balanced between opposing views than the evidence actually suggests, to contend that the good and the bad are equal parts of the whole residential school story. Bayek explained that people only focus on the bad for political reasons and noted that it was her duty to, quote, stick up for the other side. The problem with Bayek's premise is that it is not supported by the evidence, or historical scholarship, or survivor testimony. Bayek's equal weighting of good and bad reveals her misunderstanding of the historical consensus, that the problems of the Indian residential school system were systemic, that the problem with residential schooling was not only the individual cases of neglect and abuse, but that for over 100 years, the government colluded with churches to devise, deploy, and defend a genocidal school system that removed children from their families, often by force, to undercut and attack Indigenous lifeways to support colonization and Canadian nation building. whether an individual student had a positive recollection in that context, is not an equal weighting of good and bad. Again, while some former students recall positive experiences, or whether employees believed in their benevolent intentions, which the TRC acknowledges, all of that does not change the genocidal effects of the system. That's the hard part. Despite the inaccuracy of Bayek's comments in the Red Chamber, she nevertheless received a lot of support for making them. On the 6th of April, 2017, a month after making her speech, Bayek used her Senate website to release a statement defending her position and thanking people for their support. She claimed that her supporters represent, quote, the silent majority of Canada. You know where this is going. And she wanted to write to encourage their support. She says, quote, "You are not alone. You are the majority, as has been shown to me with all of the support I have received." Though declaring the majority of Canadians supported her position based on, quote, an avalanche of support, Senator was cagey when pressed on evidence for that support. Bayek claimed to have received 700 letters that overwhelmingly supported her views. This, however, does not reflect reality. An investigation by the Senate ethics officer into Bayek's use of her website revealed that the senator, in fact, received a total of 6,766 letters. Of that total, only 2,389 supported Bayek's speech in the Senate, while 4,282, the majority, were critical of her speech. Though promising to make all of the letters publicly available, Bayek only published a handful of these statements, 129 in total, and all of them in support of her comments. Though she deleted all of them in 2019 when it looked like she was going to get voted out of the Senate, but I downloaded before she deleted, these letters need more critical analysis, especially because the 100 letters dated between the 8th of March and the 11th of April, in the month after Bayek's speech, openly engage in residential school denialism and show how misinformation can grow and spread quite quickly. So turning now to the selected support letters, Bayek chose to showcase on her website between 2017 and 2019. I just want to give you a sample of them today, as I think they reveal, a lot of the common talking points that denialists use and that you might be familiar with. And in my analysis, I cluster the comments into three broad categories that I'll walk us through and give us some examples. So the first is personal knowledge. The second is ignorance and anti-Indigenous racism. And the third is something I'm calling worldviews in collision, or those that actively promote assimilation, aggressive assimilation. And what I want to show is that those writing to support Bayek drew in differing ways from all of these categories to further advance denialism in keeping with Memi's view of colonizers who accept. So let's start with maybe the easiest to understand, and that is the personal. Many of Bayek's support letters defend residential schools based on various kinds of personal information. I'm sorry, this might be not very visible at the back, but I'll explain them as we go. Some authors admit to having direct experience working in the schools, and it is clear that they are seeking refuge in Bayek's comments as a kind of absolution of wrongdoing for themselves and for family members. In fact, the very first letter to be posted on Bayek's website is from Richard, who writes on behalf of himself and his partner, who have, quote, a combined experience of 26 years in Aboriginal schools, and thus, quote, witness firsthand the positive anecdotes and experiences of those who gained from their attendance at residential schools. Makes sense. People who worked in the schools defending themselves, writing in to thank Bayek for having the courage to stick up for them. But that's not the only kind of personal knowledge. So while some chose to defend their work or the work of family members. Others spoke of their positive personal experiences talking with Indigenous people. Here we have a writer who wrote to thank BAIC for, quote, having the courage to say what millions of Canadians have been thinking for years. That yes, there were terrible things that happened at residential schools, but not everyone that attended a residential school had a bad experience, this author says. The author bases this conclusion on her experience of once having attended an art exhibit at Fort McMurray in Alberta, where she met a Native artist who told me how grateful she was to the nuns and priests in her community who ran the school. Sort of might be true, might be trying to make a sale. There's no critical thinking about that personal exchange. And of course, she takes that one limited example and then extrapolates to the whole system that it really was positive. So all of these writers gained personal knowledge from family members or former employees or students who spoke favorably about their time in residential schools for a variety of reasons, and thus they have a hard time accepting the overwhelmingly documented evidence about the system's overall genocidal effects. While some authors wrote to support BAIC based on their personal experience, others admired the senator's stance on residential schools simply because it created space for them to voice their ignorant views about Indigenous peoples and openly perpetuate anti-Indigenous racism. These writers remained unconvinced that they should care about Indigenous people. And as a result, they generally accept, buy into, and even propagate racist stereotypes that demean, diminish, and dehumanize Indigenous people deliberately, and deny any responsibility for colonization, and by extension, efforts at reconciliation. The worst of these letters have gotten a lot of public attention. I've written an article that talks about some of these, so I'm not going to give the most racist ones more of a platform here. But if you're interested, I can share the article with you for free. But you know this, right? We live in a country where the national broadcaster turned off comments on stories related to Indigenous people because the racism was so wild. But I will give you some of a sense of the ignorance on display. In terms of ignorant views, BAIC's support letters, like BAIC's original speech, are full of incorrect assumptions rooted in misinformation. Denialism, in fact, thrives on it. Kevin writes, your remarks to the effect that teachers and leaders involved in the program were by and large well-intentioned are obviously true. It's too bad you are under attack for speaking truthfully. The evidence presented by the TRC reveals that such an assumption is in fact not obviously true. Similarly, C wrote to support BAIC and explains, I feel that the current dialogue, re this part of our history, is grotesquely unbalanced. You are right to mention that it was neither the residential school employees or government intention to be cruel or to wipe out an entire race. Again, here we see that idea of false balance on display. I want to hear more positive stories, as a lot of Manitoba-specific denialists talk about. And here, the TRC report and the weight of scholarly research, including my own, presents the full evidence to show that while not all employees were cruel, many were. And the government's clear intention from the beginning was to use the system to kill the Indian and the child and bring about the end of Indigenous lifeways through coerced assimilation to support Canadian nation building, as uncomfortable as that might be. Though many of the support letters BAIC received used personal knowledge or racist or ignorant views to downplay the negative effects of residential schooling, others simply doubled down on the need for assimilation to force Indigenous peoples to participate in Canadian society. And this aspect of the letters, and denialism generally, has received less attention, but I think needs to be directly confronted. Many of the authors in this next category are unwilling or cannot comprehend that Indigenous peoples have their own cultures, languages, spiritualities, economic practices that residential schools deliberately and systematically sought to eliminate eradicate, and replace. Simply put, many letter writers lament the closure of the schools because they still believe in the value of coerced assimilation as a beneficent project of civilizing Indigenous peoples. Linda wrote to Bayek, quote, "Like you, I believe the institution of residential schools was well-intentioned." This is post-TRC, right? Was well-intentioned and was an attempt to solve the Indian problem by integrating the children into the new way of life in order that they could function better with language, health, and skills, as if Indigenous people didn't have language, health, and skills before. Similarly, Terry, in a letter that draws on all of the categories here, argues, quote, "Certainly the decision to assimilate First Nations into Canada was and remains the correct one." B takes it further, suggesting, "I think residential schools were a noble and honest attempt to treat natives as equals and integrate the community into the new, productive, rewarding Canadian life." Roy personified the unquestioned acceptance of assimilation by defending residential schools in perhaps the most self-centered, ethnocentric way possible. That kind of took my breath away when I read this for the first time. He says, "The fact is there are two good things that came out of residential schools. One, when I see an Aboriginal person, I can talk to him or her. And two, they can operate in our modern world." The author then concluded, quote, and this is the revealing part, "Please hang in there and do not let the fools who think they can implement all of the recommendations of the TRC committee. It would destroy our nation." So these writers promoted the merits of forced assimilation and defended residential schooling and attacks on Indigenous lifeways today, in the present, as immensely beneficial to Canada and Canadians, because it protects and extends the colonial status quo. Whether through personal knowledge, ignorance, and anti-Indigenous racism, or a belief in assimilation as beneficent, or a combination of these, Bayek supporters employed denialism to distance themselves from the effects of residential schooling and to defend ongoing colonization and the power and privilege it affords them as commonsensical. Indeed, Memy explains that this kind of behavior reassures colonizers who accept that colonization is eternal, and it encourages them to look towards their future without any worries of any kind. Okay, conclusion, connecting all of these dots. Although Bayek has now retired, the residential school denialism she helped popularize remains a barrier to reconciliation, as Murray Sinclair recently pointed out. Indeed, Bayek's comments defending residential schooling and trying to undermine public confidence in the TRC and her support letters are but one example of the growing phenomenon of denialism. More recently, a teacher in Abbotsford, BC, assigned a homework assignment where students were instructed to search for online articles outlining the positive experiences of residential schools, and the teacher starts things off with a denialist article to get them started. Similarly, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien spread denialism on a radio talk show in Montreal, saying he went to a private boarding school and it worked out pretty well, which is pretty remarkable because Jean Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs while the residential school system was still in operation. Yes, right? He was in favor of coerced assimilation. Former federal conservative leader Aaron O'Toole was caught on camera coaching young conservatives at Toronto Metropolitan University how to manipulate residential school history in debates to score political points, downplay John A. Macdonald, the conservative origins of the system, focus attention to the liberal involvement, when in reality, the sad part is that residential schooling was a bipartisan project. As well, a number of academics, many of them fired or retired, some of them right here in Manitoba, have engaged in or supported this despicable denialism, denigrating Indigenous communities, searching the former sites of residential schools for potential unmarked graves, suggesting it's all just fake news, a big hoax, and a lie. Pretty disgusting stuff, and you can really go down the rabbit hole. But they'd be happy to sell you their books and take your donations on their far-right websites. It's mostly just a handful of the same sad people, the same people a decade ago that were complaining about the Aboriginal industry and taxes, et cetera, have now moved on to promoting denialism as a new form of anti-Indigenous hatred. But the problem is that increasingly politicians have started to legitimize a lot of these very disturbing denialist talking points as a way of garnering support, particularly amongst far-right conspiratorial types, and this is where things can get really dangerous. This is where I'll end. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith spread the mass grave hoax narrative on her for-profit social media platform, and current Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who notably ditched out of the 2008 apology for residential schools to spread racist stereotypes about Indigenous people on talk radio, was recently in Winnipeg giving a fundraising talk for the Frontier Centre, a far-right think tank that has done much to spread residential school denialism, including in 2008 taking out radio ads questioning the truths about the system to delegitimize the TRC report. A counselor in Prince Edward Island made this sign for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation last year. It says, "Truth, mass grave hoax, reconciliation, redeem Sir John A.'s integrity." This was on his personal residence. He just decided to put out this sign for Orange Shirt Day. 2, right? We can often lull ourselves into thinking this is just mean things people say on the internet or, I guess, on their front lawn. It doesn't have, any real-world significance. The problem is that we need to disabuse ourselves that this dehumanization is only in the form of discourse. It manifests into actual real-world actions. And here in Winnipeg, right, we have a serial killer who targeted Indigenous women, who at the time of his murders posted residential school denialism online. As my colleague Negon Sinclair has written, right, fomenting this kind of hate sets the stage for these heinous crimes. So these examples of denialism all seek to misrepresent residential school history in ways that downplay the system's devastating effects and mobilize a lot of this discourse as a form of anti-Indigenous hatred. And we must take these attacks on truth and reconciliation seriously. Denialists, then, are not just simply dim-witted. They are afraid that reconciliation will unsettle their material interests and position of power in colonial society, personally or politically. In keeping with Memi's profile of the colonizer who accepts, Bayek and other residential school denialists are choosing to seek refuge in an assemblage of misinformation and untruths. This, however, I argue, is a false refuge. Denying the colonial past and present prevents non-Indigenous people from being part of the project of reconciliation and the efforts to build sustainable and reciprocal relations with Indigenous people that could actually resolve their crisis of legitimacy and help them live in these lands currently called Canada in a good or at least better way. Thus, contrary to Bayek's response, right, when pressed by a reporter about her defense of residential schools, that she didn't need any more education, it's clear that actually what is needed in our current era of truth and reconciliation is more, not less, education about the ongoing effects of Canadian colonization and the opportunities for all in deep, unsettling, and meaningful reconciliation. In fact, Murray Sinclair always says that education is what got us into this mess, and education is what's needed to get us out. And I want to commend you all for coming and committing to that path of learning and being part of this series. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was clear in its final report that reconciliation is not, in fact, an Indigenous problem or burden. It's a Canadian responsibility. And learning how to identify and confront residential school denialism wherever we see it, online, in our interpersonal relationships, in the hockey dressing room, in our faith-based groups, can be an important way of helping to put truth before reconciliation. And that's my invitation to you this evening. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if we have time for questions. Okay, well, I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Just raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll get a microphone over to you just so everybody can hear your question.
Yeah, thank you.
That's the important part.
Thank you very much. One of the interesting things about residential school denialism is, so how do we kind of deal with it, like from the media perspective, when we're, because Canada is a major center for, I guess, American international media. And so how do we deal with kind of the US who hasn't really reconciled or even started this kind of process, and we're at a point where we're putting tax credits into a lot of their productions? And so how do we conceptualize that, I guess from that colonial perspective with memory like you're mentioning, how do we conceptualize that and relate to that as Canadians when we're potentially producing content that might be supporting this narrative for a country that hasn't really come to terms with their history of genocide?
Yeah, good question. One of the things that denialists like to do is they like to pick on media, right? And we see this developing as a far-right strategy out of the US. For example, one of the things, if you look at conspiracy theories in the US right now, a lot of them are right-wing media pundits who will pounce on errors that media make to prove that there is a conspiracy. The famous example is Alex Jones. You can Google him, you can figure out him. He was one of the main people perpetuating the conspiracy theory that the Sandy Hook massacre was staged, okay? And one of the ways that conspiracy theory, he got that off the ground, was he preyed on early reporting of that school shooting that had inconsistencies. And he said, because of those inconsistencies, right, this is really just a government hoax meant to get people on board to take away your guns. And those inconsistencies in media reporting all of a sudden became this massive conspiracy theory that a lot of people believed in, right? We live in an age right now where a lot of those conspiracy theories that seem completely outlandish, they have seeds of truth, and those are nurtured by conspiracy theorists, and then they are spread. One of the things about residential school denialism is that much of the denialism that we see that's posted on Rebel News, Western Standard, the places where you're going to find it, it actually gets picked up and used internationally. So I've been writing a lot about how the very fierce debates over whether the British Empire was good or bad, okay, in the UK right now, a lot of them use denialist articles about residential schools and misrepresent what was going on to justify the British Empire as a whole. And you see denialists partnering with media pundits in other parts of the world. Sky News in Australia, we've seen Matt Walsh, who's a far-right kind of conspiratorial podcaster in the US, inviting Canadian denialists onto the show to kind of spread those ideas. And I think that this is really important because in the United States right now, there is work being done to reckon with the boarding school system and its legacy. And I think we can see that, people are engaging in Canadian denialism, and they're taking those talking points and they're deploying them in the same kinds of ways in the US. So I think We need to think of denialism not just as a homegrown Canadian phenomenon, but actually something, as I was trying to suggest by invoking Memi there, that the ways in which people try to legitimize colonialism often end up looking very similar. And because colonial tactics like using schools, right? Canadians didn't come up with that. The Americans didn't come up with it. They were borrowing from boarding schools in India and Ireland and elsewhere around the British Empire. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that denialism needs to be understood as a global phenomenon. And the more we connect those dots, we can come up with better strategies, not just to deal with it here in Canada, but anywhere that it rears its head. And media, in particular, thinking about the role that media plays both in perpetuating denialism, but also, you know, the work of journalists in particular calling out misinformation as it's being reported and challenging those narratives for Canadians who don't maybe know everything, but rely on those reports to help make up, you know, their mind about particular issues.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. One of the things I've just kind of been dealing with recently is I'm involved with the Academy Museum in Los Angeles with some of the people talking about changing exhibits. And it's such a complicated problem because you have the California genocide that basically reduced the indigenous population of California to next to nothing. And then you have a history of eugenics on top of that, and then an industry that profited off of the display of that genocide. And how that functions kind of bleeds directly to someone like Elon Musk, who's saying, of course, I'm from Saskatchewan, I'm part Canadian, I've got ties. But at the same time, he's putting out basically statements about indigenous people, and he's using Arnai's Cody, who, as you know, was actually part of Walt Disney, but he was actually Sicilian. And so the level of misrepresentation that fits internationally, like you said, it is a multi-pronged problem. So thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. I'm wondering if you could help give us just it's not an easy response, but when I have a conversation with a friend or an acquaintance, and perhaps they've initiated the conversation or they make a statement to me, something like, well, I just don't understand. I didn't do this. It's not me and my family. Can you help give me a couple of thoughts about how I can respond without getting up on my pedestal and giving them the lecture?
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things that I talk a lot about is that denialism, the hard work of confronting denialism often happens mostly in interpersonal conversations. It's a family member, a loved one, a friend, an acquaintance, you know, that says, oh, you know, I hear about this, but I really think that we should balance the good and the bad. Or, you know, residential schools were well-intentioned. Or I don't really understand, you know, why would children be dying at school? Or they'll say something like, I hear this quite a bit, that, you know, Indigenous children died at residential school mostly from tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was very prevalent in the early 20th century, so, you know, what's the big deal? Right? This is a very common denialist talking point. And I often use that as an example because if anyone's read the Truth and Reconciliation report, they will know that that actually is true, that many people died of tuberculosis in the early 20th century. The problem, as the TRC report helps us understand, is that conditions of overcrowding, poor nutrition, lack of proper sanitation exacerbates the spread of tuberculosis. And as a result, Indigenous people died in higher proportions than in the regular population. Now, anyone who knows that, when their uncle brings that up, will be able to slice through that denialist talking point real clearly, right? That they know, I hear what you're saying, but here's the actual truth. The problem is that we live in a time where many people are committed to reconciliation, but they actually don't know the full truth. They know they should know the truth, but they don't actually feel empowered to be able to use that education to challenge those talking points in live time. So a lot of people end up sitting on their hands. They know that that's wrong. They just don't have the information. And so I think, you know, this might be a trite answer for an educator, but education bridging that educational gap is how we can have better conversations. So for you in particular, that means part of the work of putting truth before reconciliation is knowing more about it, so that you feel more confident in having those conversations. But it's not easy. I mean, if it were that easy, we would have done this already. The problem is that, and I've argued this elsewhere, that denialists actually don't care about the truth. That's the hard part. You can slice through this talking point and then they'll just come up with another one. It's not actually about the talking point. It's the fact that they feel threatened by reconciliation, that their pride, that their understanding of themselves and their country is somehow under attack, and they're just using this as a form of defense. I think the hard part is that you can't change that overnight. You can't change that with helping them understand the Truth and Reconciliation report. But as a start, inviting them into saying, when you hear them using a particular talking point, you can say, I understand how that might seem like it makes sense, but actually there's a lot of evidence that shows that that's not actually accurate. And invite them into finding out, in her honor, we're talking about resources. And you can come and take a class with me, or you can just send me an email and I'll mostly give you the resources and where to find them for free. Don't tell the University of Manitoba that I said that. There's lots of resources, including the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, right, that makes these available. I know Sandra is here. She runs free workshops on truth and reconciliation and residential school history. So, taking one of those and maybe inviting your uncle to come along or your friend, right, to break down some of those talking points can be an effective way. And you don't have to do it in a combative way either. You can invite them into that conversation and say, I used to think that, but I read this book, and this might be a way of having a conversation with them. And you might not be able to convince them, right? But if we can all collectively take on some of that work, there will be fewer and fewer people who will believe those talking points, and there will be less work to do. We cannot have an individualized approach to this. We need to be figuring out ways collectively to be doing this work too. There was a hand in the back, or? Oh, you got the mic. Go for it.
I do have the mic ready. Yeah. I actually was just going to say, my name is Sandra Bender. I essentially run public education for the NCTR, including the coordination of the series. I was literally just about to mention that we have a free monthly weeknight webinar that we call Residential School History and Legacy 101. I change what night it's held on, just so it's not always conflicting with kids' soccer games or yoga class or whatever. That's a joke I make at the end of my own presentations all the time. Like, if you have that problematic uncle or a colleague who just needs to know a little bit more, send them to one of these. Because I think, generally speaking, there are those hardcore denialists out there, but I like to think the majority of the general Canadian populace is not that far and hard set. We have a mix of ideas and of notions around the history of our nation, and are sort of reconciliation curious. They just need to know more. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you, and with Senator Murray Sinclair, that education is the thing most needed. And the thing is, as a genocide scholar myself, that was my other small thing I just wanted to say before we pass this off. It is still, in many countries that have perpetuated genocides, illegal to refer to them as genocides. The Armenian genocide is not recognized in Turkey as a genocide yet, and considered an act of treason to call it one. The fact that we have the privilege as Canadian citizens to tell the truth publicly is not one that we should take lightly.
Yeah, and I'll just one quick response as the mic goes back. I have a lot of optimism, right? I'll just give you one quick story as the mic is getting passed in the back. So my neighbor is a elementary school librarian, and she invites me each year to talk to students for I Love to Read Month. So I'll read them, stories from Indigenous authors that write about residential schools for kids, and I have conversations with them. And the first year that I went to the school, I'm thinking, I don't know what this is going to be like. I have a new daughter, but at the time I didn't have kids. I don't know what the kids are talking about. And I asked them before I started, what do you know about residential schools? Thinking, like me, they grew up knowing nothing or limited amounts. And this kid puts up his hand in the back, and I'm thinking, okay, where's this going to go? And he's like, well, residential schools were a church and state sponsored program for over 100 years to remove children from their families, to perpetuate colonialism. And now we have Orange Shirt Day, and I know the elder that comes to our school, and I'm thinking, why am I here? The kids are going to be fine because they know more, right? They are growing up learning about this. And if we can continue to make sure that there are spaces like this, educational events for everyone, I really do think education is going to win out. It's just going to take some time. And we need to not lose our hope, right? That, it's a lot of work to do this. And then it feels very deflating, when you get someone that trots out but isn't this well-intentioned? I hear that all the time. But you try to figure out ways that a lot of people don't know this. They haven't had the privilege of learning in a good environment that makes them feel like they don't need to be on the defensive, that this is actually something that if they lean into can be part of them contributing to making the world around them better. I know that is the very educator answer, but that's what I believe. Last question in the back.
I think you just kind of answered my question in what you just said, because I'm thinking about Mimi's concept of the colonizer acceptance and how our desire to belong and feel legitimate in a world makes us psychologically very defensive about the truth and easily backsliding into denialism. So, education, I think it's very important that we have a Truth and Reconciliation Day as an opportunity to renew our commitment to the truth and have these education opportunities. But are there other things we need to do in order to address psychological denialism?
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is probably a good way to end, because I'll give you two answers. I'll say, of course, there's a lot more that we can do. I think the pessimistic part of me thinks, I've been doing this work for the last 15 years, that in some ways Canada has rushed reconciliation and left the truth behind, right? And that puts us in a very difficult spot, especially as politically things can change quickly. And people who are legitimizing denialists all of a sudden have a lot of power. That is concerning, to be perfectly honest. But I do think, again, that I'm hopeful that if we reconceptualize reconciliation as instead of it being a threat, helping people understand the opportunity. Because this is the thing, is that ironically, the defensiveness keeps Canadians stuck in the colonial cul-de-sac, in a space where, our legitimacy is derived from honoring our treaty promises, in a society where we don't. Perfectly honest, right? That is a form of illegitimacy. And so denialism actually keeps us stuck in that, instead of figuring out how can we break through to actually build better relationships that can, form those better alliances that will allow us to not be in that defensive mode, right? So I think, part of the answer is education, yes. But part of it also is keeping that conversation going, no matter what winds politically come, right? Like I'm glad that there is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, but we got to be doing a lot more than talking about it once a year in September, right? This is an ongoing project. Undoing a lot of that colonial baggage needs to happen not just in September. And we need to find ways outside of just the educational structure for that to happen. That's why I think of education more broadly. that it does take the form of having those interpersonal conversations. Because it's hard. And I think anyone thinking that reconciliation was going to be easy after reading the Truth and Reconciliation report didn't read it very carefully. It is very clear that it's going to be a challenge. But the benefits of working together on that, I think, outweigh what's going to happen if we refuse this opportunity and punt this issue continuously down the road for other generations to deal with. I think the consequences of that are going to be quite dire. But I'm hopeful that crowds like this make me feel like we are actually doing good work. It's just difficult some days. But you being here gives me a lot of hope too. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carleton. Thank you for myself personally for helping me continue on my own journey in this path. I think it's important conversations and continuing conversations, exactly as you said. It's not a once-a-year thing, and we all have a lot to continue to learn, so thank you for continuing that. I wanted to mention that the next topic in this series is Indigenous legal rights, UNDRIP treaty rights, and the TRC's calls to action. That'll occur on October 17th for those that might be interested. I know some of you come to each one of these, so that's the next one. And registration opens October 3rd at 10 a.m. So the guest speaker for that is Dr. Brenda Gunn. So watch out for the news release on Her Honor's Facebook and Instagram pages. With that being said, thank you again very much for coming. I will say that we have till 8:50, we'll do 30 minutes for some light refreshments. They're going to be through this door here and into the dining room. You're welcome to look anywhere on the main floor here if you haven't had a chance to look around. Again, washrooms are in the back. And we will be sticking with that 8:50 time frame, so if you do forget, the other aides and I will help you along with that. Since this is Her Honor's home, and we want to be mindful of that, again, I would just ask that everybody please remain on the first floor. That is the only public floor. The rest are private areas. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask anybody in uniform. We're happy to help you out. And thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Have a great evening and a safe ride home.